Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! When I was a kid, my parents were always caught up with work, leaving me with limited company during the day. Luckily, my best friend lived right across the street. We spent countless hours together playing, laughing, and sharing secrets. However, my friend's family had a nanny, and her presence in their home would eventually lead to unforgettable incident. We will call my friend Emily and her nanny the entitled nanny, or EN for short. This nanny was supposed to take care of Emily, make sure she did her homework, and keep the house tidy. In reality, this nanny spent most of her time lounging on a couch, glued to her phone or watching movies, rather than tending to her responsibilities. Emily's grades suffered as a result, and her parents grew increasingly concerned. Initially, when the parents questioned the entitled nanny about Emily's poor academic performance, she'd respond with excuses like, "I tried to make her study, but she won't listen." At first, the parents believed her, but as time passed, they began noticing that the nanny was neglecting her other duties around the house. The parents considered firing her, but the nanny must have sensed it. One day, Emily and I were in her room, engrossed in a movie, when we suddenly heard the nanny's furious voice echoing through the house. She was yelling at the top of her lungs, declaring that the parents couldn't fire her. Emily and I exchanged worried glances, unsure of what was happening. Rushing downstairs, we found the parents trying to reason with the entitled nanny in the living room. "Hey, what are you doing?" the parents exclaimed. "I am not letting you take her away. You don't deserve her. I'm the one who raised her, so she's better off with me than you," the entitled nanny shouted defiantly. It was a shocking revelation. The nanny was claiming that she had raised Emily, which couldn't be farther from the truth. "I am calling the police if you won't leave this house right now," one of the parents threatened. "You can call whoever you want, you MF son of a witch. I am not leaving," the nanny retorted. The parents had had enough. They stormed out of the room and proceeded to call the police. Emily and I were both terrified. We huddled together in her room, hoping that the police would arrive soon. Minutes later, sirens blared outside, indicating the arrival of the police. Parents were outside to speak with them, leaving the nanny inside the house, simmering with anger. Seizing the opportunity, the entitled nanny rushed to Emily's room, locked the door, and turned to us with a manic expression. "I am taking you with me," she declared. Emily and I were petrified. We had no idea what she was talking about, but her intentions seemed ominous. "You don't have to do this," Emily whimpered. Ignoring Emily's pleas, the entitled nanny dragged us forcefully out the room, through the hallway, and into the garage where her car was parked. Panic surged through us as she ordered us into the backseat. "Get in the car now," she snapped. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she begged, "Please, just let us go." But the nanny was determined to escape. She got into the driver's seat and revved the engine, ready to make her get away. However, fate had other plans. One of the police cars had been parked strategically in front of the garage door, preventing her escape route. The entitled nanny's face turned a ghastly shade of white as she realized she was trapped. Just as she attempted to back out of the garage, an officer swiftly approached her car and ordered her to turn off the engine. "You're not going anywhere," he sternly warned. Realizing she was defeated, the entitled nanny reluctantly complied with the officer's orders. She was forcibly removed from the car and handcuffed. The gravity of her actions had finally caught up with her. The entitled nanny was arrested that day and justice was served. She was sentenced to 13 years in jail, followed by 10 years of probation. Additionally, she had to pay a substantial sum of 4,500 euros to the parents as compensation for her actions. With the entitled nanny behind bars, life began to improve for Emily. The parents hired a new nanny who was genuinely invested in Emily's education. With her guidance and support, Emily's grades started to improve dramatically. In the end, Emily earned a full-ride scholarship to college, and the money received from the entitled nanny's compensation was redirected toward a more positive future. Emily and I remained the best friends throughout the years. Today, we work together at an international transport company, cherishing the bond we've maintained since childhood. It all started in our quiet little gated community. I had lived there since I was just a 4-year-old boy, and now I was in college, the eldest in my family of 4. Our house nestled in a corner, our sanctuary from the outside world. Our neighbor to the right, well, she was an odd one. Let's call her Mrs. H. Things started out cordially enough between us and Mrs. H, but then came that fateful day when my dad had to lay down the law. It was a simple request, really. He asked her not to discipline me when she was in our house. That, my friends, was the day the bridge burned to ashes. From that point on, Mrs. H couldn't stand the sight of us. You see, Mrs. H had taken an inexplicable dislike to us, and her spite knew no bounds. It was as if she made it her life's mission to make ours a living hell. She pulled every trick in the book, making our existence as challenging as possible. Let me walk you through some of her greatest hits. The first part of our saga of woe involved Mrs. H's relentless obstruction tactics. She parked her car in such a way that it blocked our driveway on numerous occasions. When that wasn't enough, she strategically placed her trash can to obstruct our path as well. If that wasn't inconvenient enough, she even planted white wooden posts that seemed to serve no purpose other than to drive us up the wall. One day, as I was trying to leave for college, I found myself face to face with Mrs. H's car blocking our driveway once again. I sighed and called my dad. "Dad, it's Mrs. H again. Her car is blocking the driveway," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. Dad, who had been dealing with Mrs. H's antics for years, replied, "I'll be right there, son." He marched out to confront Mrs. H, and their heated exchange echoed through the neighborhood. She seemed unfazed by his complaints, and I could hear her condescending tone as she said, "You really should teach your son some manners." Mrs. H's mischief did not stop at driveway blockades. One day, we realized that a card had mysteriously disappeared from our home. It was a birthday card with a sentimental message from my grandmother. We had our suspicions, but we couldn't prove anything. My mom lamented, "I'm certain Mrs. H had something to do with this. She's always snooping around our property." But without concrete evidence, there was little we could do. Mrs. H denied any involvement, of course. The missing card remained a sore point in our family, a consistent reminder of Mrs. H's intrusive behavior. Our family had a beloved cat named Whiskers. Whiskers was a gentle soul who had brought us immeasurable joy. Then one day we found Whiskers lifeless in our backyard under mysterious circumstances. We were devastated and heartbroken. Suspicion naturally fell on Mrs. H, who had a history of animosity towards us. My sister couldn't hold back her tears as she said, "I just know she had something to do with this. She's capable of anything." We had no concrete proof linking her to Whiskers' demise, but the timing was uncanny. It was another dark cloud that Mrs. H cast over our lives. As if her previous antics weren't enough, Mrs. H had a knack for eavesdropping. She had a way of strategically positioning herself in her garden to overhear our conversation when we were out in the yard. Our afternoon, my friend Chris came over to study. We sat in our garden reviewing our notes for an upcoming test. Little did we know, Mrs. H was lurking nearby, listening to our every word. Chris whispered to me, "Doesn't it feel like someone's watching us?" I looked around and spotted Mrs. H peeking through a gap in the pines that separated our gardens. I shook my head and muttered, "It's just Mrs. H being her usual nosy self." Now, let's fast forward to the day that turned our neighborly feud into a full-blown legal battle. I was studying for my exams, trying to concentrate on my notes, when a raucous commotion erupted outside. Shouting and yelling filled the air, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I recognized the voice of the one who was doing the yelling, my dad. He had his moments of Karen-like behavior, and this was definitely one of them. I rushed outside to see what was happening. My dad was giving Mrs. H a piece of his mind. She seemed unfazed as usual, but the tension in the air was palpable. It turned out that Mrs. H had ordered the gardeners to cut down a significant portion of the pine wall that separated our properties. Dad was seething with anger as he shouted, "You can't just do whatever you want, Mrs. H. This is our property and you've crossed the line." Mrs. H, never one to back down, retorted, "I can do as I please, and you can't stop me." She even tried to bring my sister into the argument, saying, "How can you treat a woman this way when you have a daughter?" That remark only fueled my dad's anger further. He wasn't one to be intimidated easily, and he knew the law was on our side in this matter. Dad had had enough of Mrs. H's antics. He stormed off to the local police station, determined to put an end to her reckless behavior once and for all. When he returned, he had 2 police officers in tow. The officers surveyed the damage to the pine wall, and it didn't take them long to conclude that Mrs. H had committed a crime by violating our private property. They informed her that the gardeners who carried out her orders could face jail time if my dad decided to press charges. Mrs. H's smug demeanor faltered as she realized the gravity of the situation. Even her husband, who had remained largely neutral in our neighborhood feud, arrived home from work and couldn't hide his shock when he saw the extent of the damage. He muttered to himself, "How could she do something so dumb?" In the end, it didn't come to legal action. Instead, we reached a settlement. The entire pine wall dividing our gardens was replaced with a sturdy cement wall. We agreed to split the costs evenly, 50-50. Mrs. H, who had filmed the entire shouting match with my dad on her phone, couldn't use it to garner sympathy from the other neighbors. It was clear evidence of her wrongdoings, and she found herself isolated even further. Then she entered a somewhat depressed state. It seemed that her relentless pursuit of torment had finally caught up with her. Her neighbors, including us, had grown tired of her antics, and her husband couldn't bear to defend her any longer. He couldn't take it anymore and ended up divorcing her a few months after. Hey there folks, I'm back with another thrilling tale about my dear mother, the reigning champion of entitled Karens. You all seem to enjoy my last story about her parking escapade, so here is another gem from the vault. This incident happened roughly 5 months after the infamous disabled parking saga. Picture this. It's 2004 and I'm a fresh-faced 14-year-old navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence. My mother, who I affectionately call Hurricane Karen, has a peculiar penchant for horse riding, a hobby that has never piqued my interest. My sister, on the other hand, is an inspiring equestrian. Through her relationship with gravity, often leaves something to be desired. Now, my mother, bless her heart, is not the most resilient when it comes to equine adventures. In 2002, she experienced her first rodeo. Quite literally, a particularly ill-tempered horse decided to buck her off, and the result? A broken leg. Not one to learn from experience, she repeated this feat in 2004. I wasn't there to witness the spectacle, much to my disappointment, but she managed to break the same leg again. I can't quite recall whether it was her left or right fibula, but trust me, it was broken. You know what makes a Karen even more Karen? A Karen in pain. With her leg encased in a cast for a seemingly eternal 8 weeks, the complaints flowed like a never-ending stream. She grimed about every twinge and ache, even though she was doped up on enough painkillers to numb a rhinoceros. But did this deter her from driving? Oh no. We lived on the outskirts of town, and Mom, with her apparent lack of limo drivers at her beck and call, insisted on getting behind the wheel. Yours truly, the unwilling accomplice, was dragged along on these torturous grocery runs. Looking back now, I realize I was essentially playing Russian roulette with my life. Considering the strength of those painkillers and her safe driving with a cast-clad leg, our regular grocery haunt lacked the luxury of a wheelchair for Mom's use, and she didn't possess one of those trendy moon boots to hop around in. So in addition to her constant moans of pain, she found ample reason to complain about spending a few extra dollars on groceries. If you read my previous tale, you'll know where this is headed. On our maiden grocery voyage with Mother Limbs a lot, She parked her trusty steed minivan in the coveted disabled parking spot. "I'm allowed to park there. It's disabled parking and I'm disabled," she proclaimed, her logic as impeccable as ever. Can you guess what happened when we returned from our shopping expedition? Take a wild guess. You got it, she received a fine. Shocking, I know. Furious, she hobbled back inside the store with her crutches to unleash her wrath on the unsuspecting store employees. She wanted me to accompany her, but I, dear readers, was not keen on being anywhere near the impending Hurricane Karen eruption. Instead, I opted to stay in a car, attempting to shield myself behind the sun visor. About 5 minutes later, she stormed back, flinging her crutches into the back seat before plopping herself into the driver's seat with a huff. The door slammed shut and a cacophony of inaudible, angry mutterings filled the car. She was fuming about the unfair fine. I couldn't resist chiming in despite knowing the futility of it all. "You still need a permit to park there, Mom. Remember last time?" I had warned her when she initially pulled up, but alas, Karen logic prevailed. "They should have made an exception for me. It's obvious that I'm disabled," she retorted. I sighed, preparing for another fruitless debate. "What about when I broke my ankle? That didn't make me disabled. Temporary impairment doesn't equal disabled." "Temporary what? Get your mind out of the gutter," she quipped, a confused look in her eyes. I suspected those painkillers might have made her hear something else. "Okay, Mom," I conceded, realizing that further argumentation was futile. Sometimes it's just better to let the Karen storm blow over. And blow over it did. Though she continued to sulk for the duration of our ride home, a $200 fine heavier. This marked her second offense and the price had significantly escalated. But true to her nature, she attempted to wriggle out of paying it. As they say, ignorance is not a disability. The subsequent week saw Hurricane Karen nursing her leg, regaling anyone within earshot with tales of her equestrian exploits and her perceived persecution by the grocery store's management. Each retelling painted her as a martyr, bravely battling the injustices of the world, one parking spot at a time. Hey everyone, I just got back from my friend's wedding in Mexico, and I need to get something off my chest. I'm wondering if I'm the jerk in this situation, so I thought I'd share the story with you all. So, we were at this fancy all-inclusive resort in Mexico for my friend's wedding. It was a beautiful place and everyone was having a great time. There were some group activities planned, including a dinner reservation at one of the resort's restaurants. Now, here is where the drama starts. The best man, let's call him Dave, had a thing against potatoes. Yeah, you read that right, potatoes. I mean, he didn't have a potato vendetta or anything, he wasn't just allergic, and as far as I know, potatoes hadn't harmed his family in some dark alley. But for some reason, this guy just didn't want him with his meal. Here is where I come in. I happen to speak Spanish, and when Dave asked me if I could help him out, I thought, sure, why not? So I asked the waiter to kindly exclude potatoes from Dave's meal. Seemed like a simple request, right? Well, guess what? They served them potatoes anyway. Let me tell you, Dave was not pleased. He made a big scene about it, loudly complaining to everyone at our table that he had been maliciously served these stracci tubers against his will. He made a big scene about it, loudly complaining to everyone at our table that he had been maliciously served these starchy tubers against his will. The whole restaurant was practically watching and listening to him go on and on about these potatoes. Now Dave did eat the rest of his meal, but he just wouldn't let go of the potato issue. I couldn't take it anymore. The frustration got the best of me, and I did something that, in hindsight, might have been a bit over the line. I reached over, grabbed the potatoes with my hand and placed them on my own plate. And then, yes, I ate them. Dave was left sitting there utterly stunned. He didn't know what to say or do, and after a moment of silence, he got up and stormed off to his suite. He avoided me for the rest of the trip, but he made sure to let everyone know what a jerk I was and how unladylike my behavior had been. Honestly, all I wanted was for him to stop going on and on about these darn potatoes. It was ruining the evening for everyone and I just couldn't stand it any longer. Now, my friend, the pride wants me to apologize for causing this whole drama. So here is a big question. Am I the jerk in the situation? And now some comments on a post. Someone saying you're not that jerk. You removed the problem. Hilariously. What's the problem now? Oh, he realized how so easy it was to just remove the potatoes and couldn't take the embarrassment. Or maybe talking about the potatoes was the only thing he could talk about and you left him with nothing to talk about. Another commenter adds, "Not that jerk. You don't owe anyone an apology. If anything, he should apologize to the party for being a whiny baby man. Also, extra points for doing something that gets you labeled as unladylike. As a fellow unladylike woman, I hope the movement grows and swallows the weak baby people whole." The third commenter goes with, "Not the jerk. You're the hero we didn't know we needed. I salute you."
And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.